Just a brief reminder, I know some of you will have been in the first webinar, which was about preparing for laying poultry. We talked a little bit about some health topics very briefly on each webinar, just touched on very briefly, didn't really go into any detail, but there is sometimes a little bit of material in each webinar that are relevant to health topics. For those of you that weren't around, if you are in Scotland, the way that you register birds in Scotland did change a couple of years ago. So this is just a reminder, if you haven't seen all of the recordings, as Jeanette says, they will be available. So don't worry, you will be able to catch up in a bit more detail. For those of you who are in Scotland, you now register your birds, any number of kept birds, with only a few exceptions that I'll tell you about. Any number of kept birds must be on the Scottish Kept Bird Register now. So that's a little bit different than the old system where it used to be if you had less than 50 birds, you didn't need to register. That isn't the case anymore. If you are registered on the old UK register as well, you do still have to register on the Scottish one as well. So just be aware of that. Another change that I was asked just to bring to your attention is that the Scottish Government recently consulted on changes to the legislation to temporarily allow two-legged carrying as part of poultry handling, your abilities for poultry handling and sort of carrying about and transport and packing and so on. If anybody's interested in that and wondered how the consultation had gone, there is now material on the Scottish Government website, which is gov.scot, and it'll take you through what the response was to a consultation on two-legged carrying and what their decision has been, and also where that's expected to go in the future. All you need to do is go onto the gov.scot website, click the little magnifying glass, put in consultation, two-legged carrying or similar keywords there, and it should take you to the page that gives you a good summary of everything that's happened. That also can be distributed to you via email. We'll make sure that last week's webinar and this week's webinar, the attendees do get some links to some extra information in an email shortly. Kept Bird Register, as we say, even one bird, you have to register on the Scottish Kept Bird Register up here. You will need to do so even if they're pets. You're not actually using them for selling eggs or meat from, for example. It doesn't count if you have your sort of budgies, parrot, cockatiel, or finches that are fully housed indoors. Or if they're outdoors but in a fully enclosed aviary, you don't need to register. But any birds that are taken outdoors at all for any amount of time, for exercise, for example, or training, they have to be registered. It is free. There's the link at the bottom of the page, gov.scot again. You search keywords, register your birds. And if you're in England or Wales, you can register on the gov.uk website instead. So as you can see, my chickens tended to be very much free range. This does put them at risk of bird flu. I know some of you will have been to a few of the webinars, so I'll just very briefly mention bird flu for those of you who have, and then we'll move on to material that hasn't been covered anywhere else. Avian influenza or bird flu is a notifiable disease that is currently, unfortunately, affecting the UK. And it has been on and off during various seasons from about sort of 2020 onwards. You have to be aware of this if you're keeping any kind of poultry or birds that are outside. It's so important. A notifiable disease is one where if you suspect that you could have it, you must inform the government, and that usually happens through your local APHA field office. But if you're not confident of who that is, and for example, you have pet birds, getting in touch with your own vet will absolutely help you contact the right people and make sure that you're basically going through all the right channels if you've got any worries at all. There are also these handy posters on the gov.scot website. if you go onto the website and you search for bird flu, it will take you to pages where it has a whole lot of written information that you can just sort of keep to hand. And if you're thinking 3 or 4 weeks' time, you're sort of going, what was it that was said at that webinar about bird flu? I'm not quite sure. There's a bunch of written resources there that just take you through all the main points, so you don't need to worry about that. It's a virus, as you would expect. It's a flu virus. It can be carried by wild birds. That's why we've been having problems with it. It can be carried into buildings on objects like your wellies. If you've been tramping about outside where wild birds have been, you can track it into poultry housing. It doesn't matter how big your flock is or small your flock is. They can all be at the same amount of risk, unfortunately, and the consequences are really severe. It's a very serious disease, and it makes them very sick very quickly. It's got a high mortality rate. If you did find that you had it in your flock, it kills birds very, very quickly. If you're talking about chickens, ducks and geese can harbour it without showing as many signs, which is why we're all encouraged to try not to mix your waterfowl and your chickens, especially if you've got problems with bird flu in the country at the time. But for chickens, they do drop very quickly from it, unfortunately. The reason that we've been having problems with it is because of these migratory pathways. So each colour is a slightly different migratory pathway. You can see that birds can go all the way from, up by the Arctic Circle, way into Russia and China. They can come all the way over to America. They can come down to Africa, and then they can come up through past Western Europe. If any of those birds get sick in any of those countries, it's a wee bit like we had that situation with COVID and people getting on aeroplanes. It just transfers disease incredibly efficiently. And you can see there's different flyways there. Some of them go from north to South America. Some of them go across Africa and up to Western Europe and the subcontinent, the Indian subcontinent. It's just basically different species of birds, different habits, different habitats. They all have their stop-off points, if you like, your motorway service stations. There's quite a few places where birds on different flyways will actually still all get together, and it's an ideal spot for waterhole, for preening, for relaxing, food sources. So you actually find that, different flyways, there are these sort of congregation points where birds on different paths can get together as well. So there really is no restriction on disease mixing and spreading there. That's why we're having these problems. How do you spot it? That's the thing that people get, obviously, understandably most worried about. If you had high pathogenic avian influenza, which is the most severe type, it's the one that's really causing us problems in Britain just now, you would know it in your chickens. A lot of them would be sick. It would be quite quick. You might even be starting to see deaths, fairly early on in the onset. They could be showing coughs and wheezes and respiratory signs like that. They could be showing diarrhea. You could see a massive drop in the amount of eggs that are laid. But the one thing is for sure, it will be a sign of a very, very serious illness that is affecting your flock. There are other things that can do that. It's not always bird flu, but with something so serious, of course, the first thing that you want to do is get on the phone to your vet. If all of your chickens are really quite ill like that. So it is something that, for the high pathogenic avian flu, it's probably not going to fly under your radar if you've got chickens. It's not something you're going to accidentally miss. There is another type called low pathogenic. That just means it's less disease causing, if you like. You may not be able to spot that yourselves, but if you did ever have a grumbling constant problem, vets will quite happily give you advice about that. That's less of an issue. I mention it just in case you happen to see it down in writing about the different types of flu. So as we said, it can be spread on items that you take into bird housing. It can also be spread from bird to bird through body fluids or feces. It's not airborne over large distances, so that's not something that we worry about. And we're currently in Britain in what's called a prevention zone. That means that regardless of where you are currently subject to enhanced biosecurity requirements. In some places, that might involve housing. If you are near an outbreak, you could be subject to a housing order where you have to take your birds into some kind of housing. But at the moment, over most of Scotland, where we're based up here doing the webinars, over most of Scotland, we're just currently subject to a prevention zone requirement of enhanced biosecurity. That means using the proper disinfectants, using good hygiene, keeping your wild birds out of your feed and out of your bedding and everything, just keeping your chickens as safe as you possibly can. That's the requirements at the moment, unless you're nearby an outbreak, in which case you could well end up finding yourself subject to a housing order instead, a bit more rigorous requirements. Where that's not practical to house things, they do ask for complete separation from contact with wild birds, such as a netted run or something like that. However, in the spirit of it, you really do, if you want to keep poultry, you need to be aware that at any point you could be asked to be subject to a housing order, and you really should make sure that you have the facilities to keep your birds separate from wild birds, hopefully in a fairly secure way. You're talking wild birds, you're talking wild bird droppings, food, water not shared between your birds and wild birds, and just good biosecurity. These are some good guides. As I said, we can pop them in an email round for all the attendees of last week and this week. If you're on the gov.scot website, the avian influenza outbreaks page is great. It also has a link to the full declaration of the prevention zone that requires us to have good biosecurity and good disinfection. If you scroll down that page to bird keepers, what you should do, then the how to spot and report the disease page has a full side menu of all the documents and posters and information you could ever need. It also has the advantage that if you do have an outbreak nearby, it should be able to tell you. It'll keep you updated as to what's happening, because after all, the problem is I can tell you what the situation is this week, but that could change by next week. So it's always a good idea to know that you can get the good up-to-date information on gov.scot website. As I say, what does it mean for you? It does mean that if you want to expand your poultry, or if you're just thinking about getting poultry, you do need to consider not just how to give them enough space if they're all outside free ranging. You need to consider how you would give them enough space if you were subject to a housing order. We have at times in Scotland been subject to a nationwide housing order in the past. It is possible if things get bad enough. Some people have been pressing into use old polytunnels, sheds, garages, covered runs to keep keep them safe from bird poo, lean-tos and old safety equipment, and just whatever you happen to have lying around. Some people have been using temporarily. That works fine for your sort of first go at it. If you are keeping poultry, then it's a good idea to think of more permanent solutions as well. If it is a bit temporary, like for instance, that little sort of plastic greenhouse there, you could probably think that with a really good storm, that's not going to last terribly long. So you do always want to evaluate what your infrastructure is and whether or not it needs to be a bit more permanent for the future, even if you're getting by with something temporarily at the moment. Because I don't believe that bird flu necessarily is going to get less likely anytime in the next few years. I think that's the thing, you have a bad year and you think, well, got through that year, maybe it'll be better in the future. I'm afraid just all of that migratory pathways and the way that the diseases have been going, we're not seeing really any signs that we're going to have less bird flu risk anytime particularly soon. So that's why I mention it. If you are wanting to know about the proper DEFRA approved disinfectants for biosecurity, there is actually a section of the gov.uk website, or you can Google DEFRA disinfectants. They have a page that will tell you what disinfectants are the ones that you really need. That could include going into boot dips if you are going from chicken house to chicken house. It could include just washing down your car wheels. It could include cleaning out your housing. And of course, your vermin control as well is part of your biosecurity, making sure that you don't get any rodents or anything into your feed and water supplies or any wild birds as well. Trees are great for cover, I would say. If you've got your house under a tree, then it's understandable why, because it's obviously going to be less cold, wet and windy under trees. But do consider how many birds are sitting in those trees, and if you're maybe getting a bit too much wild bird poo directly onto your chicken housing and chicken runs. So I would just have a wee think about that as well, the positioning of all of your infrastructure and whether or not there's any changes that need to be made. And that's our updates website. You can also ask SRUC vets, that's where I'm from. Colleagues at SAC like Jeanette can put you in touch directly with us. Your own vet is very much the first port of call. The FAS website, Farm Advisory Service website, and that's a link for those of you in England and Wales, if there are any of you, to the poultry registration page as well. I have some other sites that are a wee tip for you about finding the latest chicken info. The chickenvet.co.uk website has some of the supplies that I'll talk about for health treatments, prevention, that kind of thing in the next few slides. The VicVet website has some good chicken information by a vet who judges and shows poultry. You'll probably know the Hen Welfare Trust. I did remind our attendees last week that the Poultry Keeper website is UK based, and I think that there's some good information on there about keeping our hens happy and healthy. Unfortunately, that's the one that's going to, at the moment, they think it's going to close in May just because of internet hosting fees. So that's usually worth, I would say that that's worth taking a look at sooner rather than later. And Poultry Club, and if you have any worries about notifiable disease at all, APHA are always your first port of call along with your own vet. You can also arrange post-mortem examinations through your own vet. Even if they don't do them themselves, they may be within an SRUC catchment area to get a post-mortem done at one of our facilities as well. This is just a screen grab of the FAS .scot website, the Farm Advisory Service website, where you will find some of Jeanette's colleagues have produced various videos with tips such as handling poultry, keeping them entertained, egg handling and grading, which is certainly not one of my areas of expertise in the slightest. We have excellent colleagues in the agricultural consultancy department who have contributed some material to the FAS website, and I would very much encourage you to go and see what they've got to say as well. There's a ton of really practical information in all topics. If you are looking at online health info, the reason that I've just spent a bit of time going through some good sources for you there is because there is also a lot of crap on the internet, quite bluntly. Be aware of the source of your information that you're looking at, which country it comes from, and what perhaps the qualifications of the people are who've written it. And there's also variability in chicken uses. So some people will be talking directly to pet chicken owners. Some people will be talking directly for commercial chicken owners. There is a variability of advice that might make some advice unsuitable or impractical for your situation. And that can be something as simple as there being different advice for somebody who's got 10 pet chickens versus different advice for somebody who's got 50 chickens, which they just sell eggs at their own lane end from. There is actually different legal requirements for those two situations. So it doesn't necessarily need to be a big difference in situation. A lot of the advice on the internet from perhaps different places or maybe from forums could be illegal or at the very least bad practice. Sometimes forums can be confusing that way. this is just an example for you as we're starting to talk about health, specifically to let you know that if you bought from a large supplier, this is an example of how many vaccinations and treatments that they could have had before you got your point of lay poultry. So you can see that there's an absolute ton of different vaccines that commercial producers do sometimes use on their chickens. If you were mixing these commercial chickens with pedigrees that maybe understandably didn't need in their previous holding to be protected from specific diseases, or didn't need to be vaccinated as they've never really had problems before, mixing vaccinated chickens and unvaccinated chickens, you've already started out with a difference in their health and their immunity. And not going as blunt as vaccinated chickens good, unvaccinated chickens bad. That's not where I'm going with this, because they come in such massive batches that there is sometimes no way for smaller pedigree breeders or smaller breeders of pet or small commercial chickens to really do vaccines with any degree of economic or practical ease, if you like. So it's certainly not just vaccinated good, unvaccinated bad. What I am telling you is that it's a good idea to have a think about what vaccinations they've had if you're going to mix them. For example, Marek's disease vaccine it's a disease that is pretty ubiquitous throughout the commercial world. Almost all chickens from commercial suppliers will have had the vaccination. The vaccination doesn't necessarily stop the chickens shedding the virus. So if you end up with a vaccinated chicken, that could have the virus and shed it. If you have an unvaccinated chicken, all of a sudden you've got a wee bit of a problem. So yeah, just have a little think about if you are going to mix them, maybe have a chat to your vet, maybe find out what vaccinations the chickens have had, what they might need, and just do have a little think. And we'll talk about that a little bit more in a sec. Chicken anatomy, main things that I want you to really know about is where your crop is. That's a little bag that is just at the top of the breastbone at the base of the neck here. I'd like you to know where the crop is. That's where they store food. They eat the food, they store it here for a little while, and then it goes off and down into the stomachs. So that should be empty first thing in the morning, and then they go and stuff their faces with the food, and they should fill that, and it should gradually get less full during the day, and then they'll probably be stimulated to stuff their faces again just before bedtime, just as they're part of their circadian rhythm, part of the daily rhythm, and then it should empty overnight, because they're not going to be up and about eating overnight, and by the morning it should be empty again. So that's kind of one of your chicken health signs, is if you know where the crop is and what it's supposed to feel like. Obviously looking at eyes and noses and back ends where the vent is and under wings and things. If you know what everything's supposed to look like in a healthy chicken, that's a really good start. Got some different pictures of combs for you. Some chickens have incredibly red combs as normal. Some of them are not quite as red as all that. That's a particularly dramatic example, but yeah, a fairly reddish comb should be normal. Sometimes it's a bit darker, sometimes it's more vivid. At the bottom left, you'll see a pre-layer comb. They're not usually developed particularly until they're reaching adulthood. That's the same for your kind of wee meat chickens and things as well. They don't really have much development to the combs. They're paler, they're smaller, that's normal too. What we don't really want to see is the top right, where you've got a fully developed comb and the wattles underneath, and everything is looking really quite pale. That could be a sign of a not very well chicken. And if they are blue, that's not a good sign. That's usually a very sick chicken. Normal chickens, as you can see, can also be a bit paler when they were off lay. So that's one of my chickens who, I think that was probably sometime around about later in the autumn, when she was starting to go off lay, maybe a bit molty. They're not always quite as vibrant and red when they're not in the middle of laying. Normal chicken should have bright, regular eyes, no snottiness or teariness, clean nostrils and beak, not particularly stinky breath. I don't really advise sticking your whole face right next to a sharp beak, but you shouldn't really be seeing much in the way of stinkiness. The crop, as we said, should be full if mid-morning to afternoon or evening, but empties normal in the morning. You shouldn't be hearing any croaking or crackly noises when they're breathing. You should have a fairly clean vent. Some chickens are a little bit messier than others, depending on how fluffy they are at the back end, but you don't really want any clumps or any staining or any wetness or anything. And I always think that if you're getting new chickens, it's quite a good idea as well to check under the wings, because if they do have any if they have any external parasites like lice or mites on them, then they quite often like to be around the vent or underneath the wings. You want nice, smooth, strong feet, no crusty scales or anything, just nice and smooth and strong, and nothing sort of cut or swollen on the undersides. They're also pretty active and vocal, and they should be going around being curious, sometimes making a bit of noise. Hunched, quiet chickens that look like they want to fall asleep are not particularly normal chickens, especially if you're out there doing something. They should be wondering who you are, what you're doing, if you're going to give them some food. That's normal chicken. Body condition wise, if you would like to keep an eye on how fat or thin your chickens are, there's a couple of different ways. You can obviously weigh them. If you have, I would use a kitchen scale, but it would be a special kitchen scale that I kept just for chickens, because you don't want poopy feet all over your real chicken scales. Weighing them can really help you to keep track of the health of your chickens if you're worried about whether or not one's looking peaky. Doesn't have to be super regular. If you just have a rough idea of, how heavy your hens more or less are, and all of a sudden you find one that is feeling a little bit thin and is a lot less than you were expecting weight-wise, then that gives you some information. There are also these body condition scoring systems online that you can get the diagrams of. This is, if you imagine a chicken laying on its back, it's a section across the chicken, so that's the breastbone coming up here. So this would be the rib cage, and then that's the breastbone coming up. And if you've really not got much muscle, that didn't help. If you've really not got much muscle tissue between the breastbone and the skin, then that's a very thin chicken. If you've got a big chunky breast muscle for a layer, because obviously your broiler chickens are going to have those absolutely massive sort of chicken breasts that almost have a concavity where your breastbone is. A big fat layer chicken is unlikely to be laying because they do use so much energy when they're laying eggs that it would be quite hard for them to be fat or obese. If you do come across a fatty chicken, then it's likely that that's the one that's not laying for you for whatever reason. So yeah, there's a couple of different ways that you can keep track of them, because they're not very good at telling you if they're ill, are they? They are prey animals, and they like to try and look as normal and active as possible for as long as they can so that they don't get picked off. A few pictures of poo for you. This is going to be especially helpful for those who are less experienced chicken keepers. Those of you who have been keeping chickens for a while will have seen probably every type of chicken poo that could possibly occur. There is a wide range of normal. For those of you that don't know, there is the white bits, which is the urine part of the excretion, and then there's a sort of greenish brown bit, which is more like just mammalian poo equivalent, if you like. But around 1 in 10 fecal deposits is a fecal poo, which is usually sticky and runny and smelly and a slightly different colour. That is normal, as long as it is just one in roughly about every 10 poos. If somebody is doing a strange poo every single time, then that's diarrhea. They can also shed little pieces of pink or red intestinal lining in their poo, which you can mistake for blood. So small flecks of sort of pinky orange stuff or small strings of it can really give you a fright if you're not expecting it, but it is just little pieces of intestinal lining. And if you do have a broody hen, they might just do one gigantic poo a couple of times a day, which can also be quite alarming if you haven't seen it before. So some lovely after dinner pictures for you. Here are some normal chicken poos. If they've been out on really lush grass, they might be a bit more frothy and watery, as you can see at the top right. They might be a little bit more slimy. They might be quite dry. It does vary with what they've been eating. This is your cecal poos that can be 1 in 10 roughly. They do look dramatically different, but if that's just the occasional one, then that's normal. And here's some examples of the intestinal lining that I was talking about. You can see that they're quite a dull reddish colour or a dull orangey red colour. It's not bright red blood or anything like that. So it's not going to be in every poo either. You're just going to see it from time to time. If you are seeing something abnormal in every poo, again, that's more likely to be a problem rather than this particular variation of normal. And in the summer, when it gets really hot, you might find that they do really watery poos because they're drinking a lot to cool down. It could be disease. So if you're not in a hot spell or, there's something else not right with them, it could be a sign that there's something going through them or that one of them has a disease or whatever. But yeah, if there is a reason for it that you can pinpoint, then it can sometimes be normal. Just make sure that they are all getting proper access to solid feed, and that's not one of the reasons why you end up with more watery poo. And of course, worms are self-explanatory. The worst worms are not actually visible. So, I mean, those are not the most they're not great, but they're not the most disease-causing worms. So just because you don't see worms doesn't mean that worms aren't causing you problems. But if you do see worms, then obviously you know they're there. This is some blood in the poo from a disease of younger chickens called coccidiosis. Now, we talked about that in our meat chickens and layer rearing, that sort of middle stage between chicks and point of lay, or chicks and age of slaughter if you've got meat chickens, a sort of teenage chicken phase. So from sort of a few weeks or so, they can be susceptible to developing coccidiosis, and we will talk about that as well before the end of tonight. This is excessive urate, so it's a bit too much of the pee part of the sort of fecal part, if you like. It's not good. It does indicate potentially that the kidneys are struggling. So we'll start off with some abnormalities of eggs, because sometimes that is the first thing that's noticeable for people, understandably. You might see soft shells, which could indicate that you don't have enough grit or oyster shell in the diet for the calcium and for the processing of feed. It could indicate a dietary deficiency in your feed if you've maybe picked up the wrong ration, or perhaps if you're giving them too many treats first thing in the morning or last thing at night. That's when they should be filling up on the really nutritious stuff. If you're going to be giving them treats, then sort of mid-afternoon is a good time to do it, so that there's plenty of hours of daylight after that for them to fill up on the nutritious complete diet before they go to bed. It could potentially just be a consequence of a lack of daylight, or it can sometimes mean that your chicken is ill. If you're getting soft shells for more than a week, or if you can't see any of these other reasons, or if you've got a few chickens affected rather than the one, you probably want to call the vet, because there are things like viruses that can cause this as well. And again, this is where weighing chickens can come in handy, because you then have information as to whether everybody is and looks otherwise healthy, or if somebody's starting to look a bit peaky. And brand new layers can lay some really strange eggs for a wee while. So if you've just bought them in or they're very young, do have a bit of patience while they get the hang of the egg laying gig. Sometimes you will see smaller eggs with paler shells, and that can sometimes happen when it's really hot. You sometimes get small pale eggs if they're having a bit of a heat wave. But be aware that a technical soft-shelled egg can actually feel quite hard. Soft-shelled can mean squishy, but it can also mean just a really incredibly thin shell without actually being soft. So if you do come across really thin-shelled eggs as well, that could be actually a technically a soft-shelled egg from the last slide rather than caused by heat wave, for example. You will sometimes get rough shells, uneven shells, or wonky shells, but they are still good and strong and the chicken looks well. You can actually sometimes get a bit of inflammation of the egg duct, which is temporary, and that might just be 1 or 2 chickens. But you can see an outbreak of that if they have a disturbance in diet, a fright, or a stress. If you brought in some other chickens, they're maybe battling each other to work out the pecking order. One person, one of our webinars said that they had a sudden increase in the RAF planes had changed their route and had started going over their farm, and the chickens got really unsettled the first few times it happened during a week, and they had a sudden outbreak of strange eggs until eventually they kind of got used to that. So anything that disturbs them can sometimes cause funny looking eggs for a bit. Double yolkers are normal, but it can be a genetic predisposition. It's essentially just chicken twins. So if you do have a hen that is predisposed to that, you could see it more than once. So if you've got regular double yolkers, it's not that likely to be a different chicken from your flock each time, just throw in a double yoker. There's slightly more likely to be one chicken or maybe a couple from the same line or whatever that are doing it regularly. If you have blood spots on the surface of the eggs, you want to check for mites, red mites specifically, because that can be a sign. And of course, if you actually, I've only seen this once, but it can happen. If you end up with a worm in an egg, that's pretty self-explanatory and it's disgusting. So you do need to get your worm control on point for that. We've had a few people phone over the years about strange tasting eggs, and we have invariably managed to narrow it down either to something about the place where the eggs were stored. One chap had creosoted or whatever the sort of slightly less carcinogenic alternative is that is still quite stinky. He treated his shed, and that was the cause for him. Also, they do like herbs and things, so you know, if they're going out in your garden or they're going out in a local field and there's quite a herby border to it, there are some quite strong tasting herbs that they do find quite nutritious. If they have been eating something a bit odd or a bit strong, then sometimes that will translate to the egg as well. If a hen has stopped laying, that can be a sign of illness, but I do want you to ask, has it really? Because some of them hide eggs, some of them go broody, which means they stop laying and start trying to hatch their eggs. It can mean a mistaken identity. Maybe you think somebody stopped laying, but actually it's somebody else. Some of your chickens might be old, which isn't always that old. For example, an age of 2 or more in really highly in commercial hybrids, some lines can sometimes start to fall off in their laying, whereas an old chicken would probably be a bit older in pure breeds. They tend to lay a bit less eggs, but perhaps slightly for some lines a bit longer, whereas the commercials are really geared to lay a lot of eggs very fast and then kind of drop off a bit. We have had in the past a chicken that started egg eating. We've also had eggs stolen by stoats. They will roll eggs down your garden to steal them, especially if they have babies in their nest. So stoats can be a bit of a problem with that as well. Corvid birds like crows and so on sometimes will try to take your eggs, and rats and things will try to eat them. Also, they do, of course, stop molting during the autumn, and we talked about that in the layer chicken webinar, the first one. In the dead of winter, when it's dreadful weather, nobody's wanting to bother making an egg, which is understandable. I don't feel like doing very much myself sometimes. This is one of ours. This is Big Red. You can see her lovely, beautifully kept plumage. She is kind of the top of the flock. And she also is a black rock, which are not really supposed to go broody very often. However, this is what a broody chicken looks like. She's a bit scruffy. She hasn't been doing her hair. She's all fluffed up. She's got a grumpy expression. And if you lift her, she is hiding under a tree and she's not laying in her nest box anymore. She's going off in the garden, hiding under a tree, and she is trying her best to make a nest. So that's basically, you think they've stopped laying and perhaps they haven't. They're just misbehaving. If it's none of those explanations, or if there's more than one doing it, then it can be a sign of a problem. They can maybe just be throwing off a minor illness. They can have had a fright. They maybe, there are things that unsettles chickens. Sometimes will stop laying very briefly, but it could be an illness as well. And that picture, if you've got your eye in, you can see the nice red combs on the back too, but that one at the front is looking a little bit suspicious, isn't it? She's just looking a little bit pale, a little bit depressed. Now, just to clarify, one of the things that I feel is important for some of the diseases that we talk about tonight is that the act of veterinary surgery includes the diagnosis of diseases and injuries to animals. So if somebody is giving you a diagnosis over the internet, technically in this country, they should really have a veterinary qualification to do that. If they're then advising you based on their diagnosis of how you should treat that animal, again, that's actually an act of veterinary surgery. There is a number of exceptions that do apply, which can be found if you're into your legal nerd stuff. It can be found in the Act itself, which is on the gov.scot website. That is the Act that it pertains to. That will probably change at some point in the future because legislation does get updated, of course. But yeah, I see a lot of people. I don't tend to go on the forums because I will see somebody that's doing something they really shouldn't. And, you would end up typing all night, every night, in a spirit of helpfulness. Of course, nothing else particularly. I'm not one for getting in arguments. It would all be a spirit of helpfulness. But yeah, there is a lot of stuff there that really it's not great advice sometimes.
Caroline, we had a question relating to veterinary stuff. If I could just pop in now.
Absolutely.
So, and this relates to your main day job. Do SRUC postmortems and / or testing require a vet referral? So maybe if you could just explain that.
They do, yeah. That's because when we produce our postmortems, our reports, there is probably going to be a lot of explanation needed as to what we found, and there's also going to need to be action taken a lot of the time. That is stuff that basically your own vet will need to do. So it's not just a question of telling the client what's happened to their chicken. If we've made a diagnosis or we've ruled out a bunch of diagnoses and we've got a few left, there's almost always some advice or action or something that your vet is then going to have to perform or act on in order to sort your problem for you. Because of course, by the time you need a post-mortem, things have gone badly. There is, from a welfare point of view and to protect the other chickens, there really does need to be a vet involved. So yeah, we also bill through your vet. So you don't end up needing to set up a whole separate account with SRUC and all the payment details and all the rest of it. We actually bill everything through your vet. And it just means that you've got that continuity of care. So yeah, it's a veterinary referral.
Thanks very much for that, and thanks everyone for putting the questions. We'll come to them at the Q&A at the end. So thank you.
Yeah,
I'll
and it's
disappear
worth
again.
saying as well, the postmortem testing in Scotland is actually subsidised by the Scottish Government, so you can get an absolute whopper of an amount of testing sometimes done for a flat rate. Which is very, very, very much cheaper in most cases than if we actually commercially charged for all of the testing, as we sometimes do for pet birds that are not part of the national flock. Maybe if you had a pet peacock or something like that, that might be charged commercially, and that could maybe be like £300 or something for a post-mortem, whereas because farmed animals are subsidised, you might find that it's more likely to be like more in the £50 mark. You still get that sort of £350 worth of testing, but you don't pay that. You pay the sort of £50 or so, and it's subsidised. So it can be a really cost-effective way to get to the bottom of your problem, provided you bring in a bird that is genuinely representative of the group problem. If you have a whole bunch of birds with respiratory disease and one of them happened to die, but that one had had diarrhea for 6 weeks and hadn't ever developed the respiratory disease, that is just a coincidental dead chicken. And I'm probably going to be able to tell you what was wrong with that chicken, but it's going to tell you probably very close to nothing about what is wrong with the rest of your chickens that you really want to get healthy again. So yeah, if you were going for a post-mortem, really great cost-effective way to deal with diagnostics if you are unlucky enough to have a dead chicken. However, making sure you choose the right chicken is the only way that you're going to make the most of your investment there, unfortunately, because a dead chicken is very convenient, but it's not always the right one, unfortunately. The most common thing that we see in our post-mortem rooms, hands down, is egg peritonitis. They start to accidentally lay internally rather than laying externally. They don't have the shell yet. It's just the sort of eggy part that goes inside, but they will look usually quite ill. They sometimes do that penguin stance that you can see. It's very upright. Sometimes they appear to gain weight if you're just sticking them on the scales, but actually their chest feels really thin and they've got a big fat belly. They'll be off their feed, they'll be dull. It's not great. Some people will try to treat them, especially if they're pets, but if they have started laying internally, the outlook isn't great for them because you've still got a bit of that egg material inside. They're quite prone to bacterial infections off the back of that. There's a reason that they started laying internally, so something might have gone a bit anatomically wrong inside as well. There's very different pet options versus producer options. You will find, if the chickens are still reasonably well in themselves, if you have a pet chicken, then a vet may be able to offer some forms of treatment. But if that was from a production point of view, then that is a chicken that's not going to be any good for you production-wise. It can really vary with severity, although it does often get quite severe eventually. And you sometimes see sort of rubbery scrambled egg looking stuff coming from the back end. It looks sometimes a bit like diarrhea, but it isn't. You do always have to at least consider the possibility of euthanasia when egg peritonitis is suspected. It'll depend on how unwell the chicken is, really. But yeah, if you do want to go down the extremely expensive route, there are things that vets can do to prevent the hen from laying in the future. So if you got the hen better from this bout of egg peritonitis and you wanted to make sure that that hen would hopefully have a chance at living on for longer, then the vet can offer you some treatments that will stop them laying entirely, which is sometimes the only way to make sure that they stay healthy afterwards. So yeah, just to make you aware of that, although for a lot of people, it would be possibly the euthanasia option. Behavioural problems, we also see quite a lot: feather pecking or feather eating. You want to find out if baldy chickens or, any kind of feather eating or whatever you're seeing is self-inflicted, or is it one of the others? Are they protein deficient at all? Again, are you feeding treats at the wrong time? Or are they getting bullied and pecked by others? If there's too many diet changes or it's too rapid a diet change, you'll sometimes find behavioural problems. If there's too much light, or if there's too many drafts or anything that make a chicken uncomfortable and unhappy and grumpy, then you'll sometimes get an outbreak of bullying. Different colours can sometimes single some chickens out as well. If you've got a whole bunch of black crofts that are sort of black and gold, you have one white chicken, maybe white chicken is going to get bullied, for example. White also shows blood up more, and chickens do tend to peck the colour red. So if you have a white chicken that has been pecked, it's going to be red in places, and that attracts more chickens to peck. So go over your management and diet. Have a think about whether or not you've got a cockerel, because his attentions can sometimes cause either wounds or problems with feathers, pulling out of feathers. And if you happen to be able to pick out a particular bully or a particular management change that you've done, then just making sure to not repeat that is the best way to deal with it. With a bully chicken, you may need to separate that chicken for a while so that the pecking order rearranges itself. You can separate them so that you can still see the other chickens in perhaps a pen right next door, or I used a large old dog crate, which was like a cage, and she had her food and water, and she could still scratch about and things like that. It was a really big old dog crate beside the chicken run for sort of a week or so until the other chickens had sorted themselves out, and then we popped Bully Chicken back in with the rest of them, and she was in a different part of the pecking order at that point, and we didn't really have the same problems in the future. Doesn't always work, but it's one of the things that you can try. It's related to vent pecking. Some chickens, again, can bully by pecking the back end. Just double check that your pecked chicken doesn't have diarrhea and have a big sticky vent that is the reason that they've started pecking. You never ever want to leave a chicken with a bleeding wound in with the others. They will keep pecking, and they can be cannibals, and they can kill other chickens quite quickly. So if you see one that's gotten bullied to the point that unfortunately there is blood there, you're going to want to take out the bleeding chicken and not just think about isolating the bully chicken. Blue spray, wound spray, until it's all dried off, and making sure that there's none of that red colour left can sometimes be very helpful. And also making sure that everybody has something to do. Too much light, as I said, could be a problem. Uncomfortable environment, a problem. But make sure they have lots of other things to pick at, places to jump up on, places to hide behind, things to scratch around in, just all the good things that we talked about in some of the previous webinars about enrichment of their environment. And sometimes it doesn't have to be that much blood. That's my blue chicken again. You can see there is a little bit of blood actually on her comb there. I think that actually might not have been a peck. I think she might have caught it on a bit of wire, but that's the sort of thing that could start off pretty small and then end up being a problem. Chicken skin does tear quite easily, and they can make a hole in each other quite quickly, but they do heal really well. So they do what we call granulate. The wound sort of starts to close over quite quickly and efficiently, but you do need to isolate until they are a bit more healed and can go back in with the rest. And that's a suggestion of some first aid kit stuff. The wound spray, which is quite often blue to take away that red colour. Anti-peck spray works for some people. My chickens were a bit variable with that, to be honest. Some of them didn't really seem to care about the anti-peck spray, which is supposed to taste bad. Some lice or mite treatment or prevention stuff is always handy to keep on hand, just in case you find them. So for example, for me, I used to use diatomaceous earth. Some house treatment for lice or mites is also handy to have. This is because in the summer especially, if you do find lice or mites, they proliferate and reproduce incredibly fast. So sometimes, if you can run out very easily to the local agricultural store and get it in if you see them, that's great, but sometimes you're not actually within that kind of area. It might not be that easy to do, in which case you don't really want to leave an infestation for, a week or something until you can get to a store. You do want to have that on hand. Some tonics or probiotics are also quite handy to have. And the last thing that we'll do tonight is we'll go through a few of the different diseases. And I'm not going to go through every disease that chickens get, because that would be mental, and we'd all be here for ages, and then you'd be vets. So, it is a lot of material. But what I want to do, the main takeaway for these list of diseases that I'll give you, is some of them pop up on forums and people give terrible advice about them. Some of them are quite good for you to recognize so that you know what you're dealing with, because you can accidentally buy them in, or because once you have them in your flock, you might be stuck with them. They might not always be showing, but you might have an infection that will grumble along in your flock without any signs for a time. But if you then change the management particularly sharply, or change their diet, or we suddenly have the world's worst run of weather, which we are currently in Perthshire, these things can make a disease that's been flying under the radar, not causing any problems, suddenly flare up. So these are the sorts of things that I just want you to have a bit of awareness of as we finish up for tonight. So, and as you can see, mites and things, worms, Marek's disease, respiratory diseases, diarrhea, the egg diseases, any of the pecking or cannibalism that we talked about. We really commonly see cancers as well, carcinomas of the reproductive system. I would say, apart from Marek's disease, egg peritonitis, and red mite, the other thing that I've seen the most of in the post-mortem room has actually been a tumour of the reproductive system. That happens really frequently in old chickens. So yeah, we can talk about that as well. By the time it does look ill, probably that chicken has been ill for a while, and it could be quite advanced, unless they've just suddenly caught a very, very sort of dramatic virus or bacteria. And for some common conditions, there's not that much practical treatment. So I'd rather that you didn't waste, your time, your resources, your money on something that you might be able to recognise as not being worth it once you've seen some of these slides. Marek's disease, lots of people have heard about it. It is a virus and it causes tumours of pretty much every organ, although they quite often turn up in the nervous system first. The classic presentation is a gradual progressive weakness of the leg or the wing. Sometimes they go blind. It is usually younger chickens. If you've got a chicken that's like 6 years old, that probably isn't Marek's disease. If you have a young chicken, it could be Marek's disease. If you have the problem that you've got with the ex-commercial hens is that they are vaccinated, but the vaccines were only ever developed to last for the commercial lifespan of the chicken. So I have seen outbreaks of Marek's disease in sort of 3-year-old chickens because their vaccine had worn off by then. They were only really meant to live till 2, if you like, in that particular system and that particular sort of set of logic. Sometimes 3 or 4 years old, we have seen outbreaks of Marek's disease, and it's because the vaccine was wearing off. We do see outbreaks when you mix unvaccinated chickens with commercial rescues sometimes, especially if you've got some really susceptible chickens like silkies or Polish frizzles. So some fancy ones are super, super susceptible to Marek's disease. It is overdiagnosed by keepers, though. Every time somebody talks about having a floppy chicken, you'll see lots of people going, Marek's disease. Don't panic, it might not be Marek's disease. It is quite common. It will depend on the history that we take as well. If your chickens are vaccinated and they're still sort of within that kind of vaccine efficacy point, it's a bit less likely to be Marek's disease. The thing that I want you to know about Marek's disease is that it survives a really long time in the environment. It comes off in the feather dust. So if you've had it, even if you get rid of all your chickens and then you want to wait a few months and get some more chickens, there could still be the virus in the atmosphere unless you've been really good with your cleaning and disinfectant and you've got cleanable and disinfectable equipment and housing and so on. So yeah, it can hang around for quite a while. Sometimes you'll see changes in the eyes. So this one's got a slightly wonky shaped pupil. This used to have a golden eye, but now it has a blue eye. We've got various weird shaped pupils here. You sometimes just see these abnormalities, but your classic is your kind of floppy, depressed, hunched, paralyzed chicken. Maybe the legs are kind of flopping out to the side. They'll stop laying, obviously. You might see a bit of diarrhea. You might eventually you're going to see death because unfortunately there is no treatment. And sometimes their crop can be all fluidy and squishy. It's not emptying properly, or it can be firm and impacted because it's not emptying properly. That can sometimes be a sign that their nervous system isn't working right because the virus is affecting that. No effective treatment. We have talked about vaccination. It's done really early on. It's done at day old. So if you're buying in point of lay pullets, that's not the time that you're going to be vaccinating your chickens. It's all down to the hatcheries. Keeping your adults and young birds apart for as long as possible is quite a good idea if you can. If you have a really mixed stage flock, you're maybe at a slightly higher risk of Marek's disease going between them. Some people will use the all-in, all-out system for hygiene. I don't know all of your situations. You might be here because you have pets. You might be here because you have a sort of rolling lane end egg system, or you might be a little bit more commercial, in which case, obviously, the all-in, all-out system might become more something that you can do. There is a bit of selective breeding going on for resistance to it as well, but that's not terribly far on. If you think you have it, do try and get a diagnosis and have a chat with your vet. There will be some management things that you can do that can avoid some risk factors for it. All is not lost if you've ended up with Marek's disease in your flock. It isn't great to have it there. It will always put your chickens at risk, but there are things that you can do to try and avoid it affecting as many of your chickens, or to try and prevent you seeing the actual disease in the future in your chickens is worth a good chat about planning for health. A lot of people see red mite, and that has gotten much easier to deal with in very recent years. Those guys, the red mites, live in the coop until the nightfall. They like cracks, such as under perches, under roofing felt, nest boxes. Plastic housing is a bit easier to clean for that than wooden. The red mites do love wooden housing, unfortunately, and they come out and they feed on the birds at night, so you're probably not going to see these mites on your birds during the day. If you want to find them, go out with a torch after dark, take a piece of paper towel and wipe around the joins of the perches where they meet the walls, and any little cracks in the walls and things like that. Just wipe it around, and if you look at that paper towel and you have smears of blood on it, then you have red mites. They can live a long time without feeding, so they can live in empty houses for a long time. And when it gets really hot in the summer, they can have such a population explosion. I mean, really, they can have as little as a 7-day life cycle from them hatching out to becoming adults and starting to spray all their babies everywhere as well. They can get very bad very fast. They feed on blood, and we see them coming through the post-mortem room as a primary cause of death of chickens. So it can be really quite serious. If you're getting it itchy yourself, if you're cleaning out the chicken house, they can bite people as well. It's just itchy and irritating, but watch out for that. The other important mite is a northern fowl mite that lives on the bird. It's also a bloodsucker, but it's a bit less resilient, and wild birds can bring them both to you, which is not very convenient of them. This is some mites on the feathers from the vent. The northern fowl mite, you'll find they live on the bird all the time, so you'll find aggregations of them all around the vent and under the wings. You can also find much less serious lice there as well, which are a bit less of a problem, but these fowl mites are quite, they are bloodsuckers, so they're quite serious when they occur. These are red mites, little fat, shiny red things. You sometimes do find large numbers of them sitting on dead birds, and as we say, they're out at night to feed on the birds, but they're not really riding around on the birds in the daylight. The signs are all to do with losing blood, pale, they don't lay as much, they're reluctant to go in the house as you would be, they sometimes get weak quite fast, and they, as I say, they could die. Blood spots on eggs are also a potential sign. You sometimes see blackened, dried blood in affected areas as well. That's not a red mite. Just before you panic, I get a lot of these in my garden. That is a red spider mite, which is a thing that lives on plants. And I think some of the species are actually quite good for garden pests or something. But if you see a really orangey thing that looks very spidery with big long legs crawling about, you'll see dozens of them in your garden if you're looking, just because they like to give you a fright that way. That's not a red mite. These guys, those guys are red mites. You see that you can't really see the big legs or anything like that. So don't panic too much if you catch a red spider mite on your chicken house. has gotten much easier. I used to use diatomaceous earth in my dust baths, and if I got some actual mites on my chickens, I would dust the chickens with it as well. And also I would use a really thorough wet cleaning and then the chemical disinfectant and house treatment that are essential for red mite. And you have to make sure that you get house treatments that are effective for red mites specifically. So that's how I used to deal with it. These days, we've actually also got on vet prescription something called Exalt that does even come in quite small bottles if the availability is good. Can come in quite small bottles suitable for backyard flocks, and it's so easy. You just have to treat them in their water twice a week apart. So it is a bit more expensive, like probably about 20 to 30 pounds more than you would pay if you were just getting a whole load of, on chicken treatments from other agricultural stores or whatever. And it's just so effective and it's so convenient that I kind of feel for a lot of people that extra 20 quid or something would be worth it. But it is, as I say, a veterinary prescription treatment. Try not to buy it in. Try to, check your chickens aren't itchy by buying in, checking them for the foul mite around their vents and under their wings and things. If you do get red mite, or if you do get northern foul mite, particularly the red mite, though, you're really going to have to scrub that house because it is all about the house. Preventative wise, I did, as I say, use diatomaceous earth just in the dust bath. I used to mix it into the dust bath. If you are using diatom, do make sure that if you're pouring it about the place, you use a mask. That is not good stuff to breathe in. You don't want to be taking big lungfuls of that stuff, and it's really fine, so it does poof out. There's also on the chicken vet website, there's some alternative treatments such as Dergal, which is a substance that you spray on your chicken house that kind of provides a film and kills the mites. There's some disinfectants that have some activity, or they think anecdotally that they have some activity against red mite. If you're constantly getting it every year, you might want to think about your house design. So yeah, there's a few things that you can think about, but it has gotten so much easier than it was in the past. Scaly leg is a different type of mites. You can see a nice smooth leg at the top. You can see a very rough leg at the bottom there. They can sometimes get quite sore with that. You don't want to pick off the scabs of scaly mite leg because it is quite sore. There's a few different ways you can treat. There's on the chicken vet website, they sell something called Dergal, which you can spray on the chicken's legs. Some people will use Vaseline as a nice cheap option. You need to smother their legs in Vaseline to cause the mites to suffocate at least weekly, and that can sometimes go on for weeks until the crusting has stopped. So it's sometimes a bit less convenient, but in a lot of cases it will be effective. But it can really take a long time for the legs to come back to normal, quite often after the next molt. And you are going to be at minimum treating with those potential treatments for at least 3 weeks, sometimes quite a bit longer. Exalt is not specifically meant for scaly leg mite. However, you will find on various veterinary websites over the last few years since it's been available, that even though it's not named on the label, that treatment for scaly leg mite with Exalt also seems to work. So those are some of your options. Worms, I get asked about a lot because we have a lab that does worm egg counts. They can make chickens thin, lethargic, they can have diarrhea, they can be pale. Gape worms is one that lives in the throat and can make them gasp. Worm eggs build up on your ground, so moving your run around that we talked about a lot in a previous webinar is sometimes a really good idea. Try and avoid overstocking your enclosures. Try to rotate or rest your pastures. Try and avoid any one area getting super wet around feeders and drinkers. Move them around. Try not to make sure that they're not leaking. Don't feed chickens from really heavily contaminated ground. You know, if you're scattering your corn or whatever, try and make sure that that's in a clean area. Some people poo pick. I haven't. That is, you know, to a certain extent for a lot of people going to be not terribly practical, but I've mentioned it. Your younger birds should always go on your freshest, cleanest ground. Make sure everybody has a good diet, nobody's deficient in anything that will make your worm problem worse. Try and discourage wild birds if you can. There are some licensed treatments that have no egg withdrawal needed for, and that means that you don't have to not eat eggs for a certain period after treatment. A withdrawal period is often stated on drugs for eggs and for meat. Any drug treatment will have been tested to try and make sure that any eggs or meat afterwards are safe for people to eat, essentially. And the licensed treatments for worms, those two don't need you to chuck the eggs away for a period. They do have a withdrawal period afterwards that you can eat the meat from your chickens, but it is fairly short. I will say if you're selling the eggs, things become a bit more complicated because technically legal in this country, you are allowed to mix wormer into your food for your chickens if they are domestic chickens and you're not selling any eggs. If you are selling eggs or meat from your chickens, all of a sudden, you're subject to a rule that only licensed people are able to mix these drugs into feed. So just that's where sometimes your bags of feed that have the stuff already incorporated in it that you might have seen at your agricultural stores, that's when those come into play. Because technically, you know, even if you're selling at the laying end, all of a sudden you're subject to different rules. There's also versions of the wormers that go in water instead of feed. And you can also do worm egg counts on chicken feces if you want to see if there's any reason for you to be doing your worming, because I know a lot of people in very small flocks on sometimes quite extensive ground won't really have that much of a problem with worms. Putting some plastic or a bit of paper underneath the roost in the evening means that you can pick out a lovely set of completely fresh and hopefully uncontaminated poo samples on your piece of paper or plastic first thing in the morning. You can bag it all up or box it all up and send it off to the vet. That slide looks a bit busy. I just want you to know there's lots of different types of worms. Not all products that claim to be wormers are going to cover all the important types of worms. At the moment, there are quite a few products that claim to be good for worms that are not technically drugs, and there's not really much evidence that they do anything. So yeah, if you do have a worm problem, you do actually want a proper wormer for it. Some of the worms don't really produce eggs. Some of them burrow into the digestive tract and cause inflammation without necessarily producing worm eggs that we can see in the poo. So that's one of the reasons that if you ever get back a really low worm egg count in your report, but your vet still says, I want to worm these chickens, that might be why, because not all worms are super visible by producing the eggs. That's all you really need to know about that slide. Some chickens just end up with a bit of diarrhea that is due to dietary indiscretion, or maybe they've overdone it with food. If you do have moldy feed or anything, that can certainly cause them diarrhea. That is for a very good reason. Probiotics, if you've just got a bit of grumbling diarrhea, and tonics might help. Do always make sure you assess their worming status if you have diarrhea. Check out your hygiene, just make sure there's nothing there that you can pinpoint to say, I think that's why. Get it checked, and if it's not improving, or if they are otherwise ill, you do want to obviously get going with some other testing. I did briefly mention the gapeworm, which is not a gutworm. It doesn't cause diarrhea. It's not actually that common in chickens. We do see it a lot in game birds, but not so commonly in chickens. But it can actually cause gasping and rattly breathing and so on. And we know that crows and rooks and blackbirds and things can bring it into your garden. If you have chickens that are otherwise a wee bit under the weather, maybe they're malnourished or slightly deficient in a vitamin, or they're a bit stressed or anything, you can sometimes see gapeworm. And normal wormers will deal with that. Another condition that I'll briefly mention to you is mycoplasma, because it is one of the more common coughing and wheezing diseases that we can see. And you can buy it in, but if your birds are in contact with wild birds, they are almost certainly going to come in contact with it. The reason that this is important is because it's a bacteria, so antibiotic in the first instance when you get your first outbreak is usually the treatment. There is a particular type of antibiotic that can be bought in small packs for smaller flocks as well, and it doesn't have egg withdrawal. Different antibiotics are also available, so you do have a range of treatments available to you. It's worth talking to your vet about. You can predispose by all the sort of usual risk factors like mixing them, transporting them, stressing them, whatever. But sometimes you're just unlucky and the wild birds have brought it in. There are other bacterial diseases as well that can cause similar sort of coughing and wheezing and so on. But yeah, mycoplasma is something we see really commonly in backyard chickens and outdoor free-range chickens. Commercial chickens are often vaccinated for it, but again, vaccine wears off. The clinical prognosis for the flock, if you do have an outbreak of mycoplasma, is usually quite good, because once you've got it, you're going to have it. Like, you're not going to get rid of it, even if you do antibiotics. It'll stop the birds being sick, but it will not completely get rid of the disease. Once you've got it, you're kind of stuck with it. But if you keep your chickens unstressed and healthy and don't put them through too many changes, you may never see symptoms again. It's something that usually, grumbles away under the surface, and then all of a sudden, if something else goes wrong, all your chickens are coughing and wheezing again. Sometimes they need a bit of antibiotic to get them back on an even keel. So first outbreak in your flock usually needs antibiotics. It's quite a good idea to get it investigated anyway. After that, you just keep a close eye on them and give a shout if you are seeing any problems. Just try and keep them as resilient and healthy as possible. And this is the sort of thing you see. You sometimes see swollen eyes, because chickens have sinuses just behind their eyes. They get a bit swollen, a bit congested up there. Sneezing, coughing, bubbling. That could be any kind of bacteria or virus, a whole bunch of different bacteria or viruses. But what do we really need to know if we have a respiratory looking chicken is that you know now that antibiotics might be needed, especially if it's more than one bird. You know that avoiding stress, and perhaps if you're able, quarantining any chickens that you buy in for 2 or 3 weeks to see if they're carrying the disease, and if they're about to start coughing and wheezing is a good idea if you have the space. So bring in your new chickens, keep them separate. If they all go to pot and start coughing all over the place, maybe you want to take them back. If they get through the first 3 weeks and they're all looking absolutely fine, they're less likely to be bringing you in disease. It is a good idea to test respiratory disease to see if you can spot whether it's a virus, whether it's a bacteria or whatever. Again, post-mortem, if you lose any, is quite a cost-effective way to do that. But do remember, if you have a massive outbreak of severe respiratory disease, there are notifiable diseases such as flu or Newcastle disease that you really need to tell people about. I've got a wee list there for anybody that's feeling particularly nerdy of a bunch of the most common ones that we've seen. So there's a fungus. If they've been poking about in your compost heap, that's less likely in chickens. We see it slightly more likely in other types of poultry. There are a couple of viruses there, and the mycoplasma that I talked about. If there's one of them that's wasting for ages and ages with respiratory signs, and it's an old bird, we do also sometimes see avian tuberculosis in backyard flocks. A wasting chicken for ages that maybe has some respiratory signs. Please do whatever you take away from this webinar tonight. If you have a really sick chicken, work yourself out an isolation place for it that is not your kitchen. We're now in the world today where we have bird flu absolutely rife, I have seen people with their chickens that have tuberculosis, which in rare occasions can affect people, and when it does, it is very difficult to get rid of. Some of the diseases that they can carry can be a problem for you and your family. If you're isolating them and nursing them in a nice sheltered spot, please try and make it a shed or something and not right beside your toaster, because that's usually where I find them. And it's not great these days, unfortunately. So check around the environment, do chat to your vet about respiratory disease, do have a think about whether it could be a worm. Even if you're talking to your vet on the phone, they might still ask to see at least one affected chicken. Some of them are happy chatting about treatments on the phone, and they'll put something behind the desk for you. Some of them, you know, in certain situations will want to see a chicken. It could be an easy fix, but if you do have deaths or a large number of cases, do have a think about post-mortem investigation. The other notifiable disease that I mentioned there can look like a variety of things, but in general, you will see some dead chickens, and any kind of big outbreak of respiratory disease or any causes of mortality from a welfare point of view, if nothing else, wants some advice or investigation from somebody qualified, not just on the forums, I'm afraid. A couple of the last things that I usually get asked about, just to finish off with, egg binding isn't all that common in chickens. You see a lot about it on the forums, but a truly stuck egg is quite unusual. If you took your chicken to the vet for that, they would probably give them fluids and make sure that they had sufficient calcium, because it can be a sign that you've got a deficient diet. It could also be a sign that they have another illness, and the fact that they've got an egg stuck now is just because they've been ill. So, you know, it's not just all about the egg sometimes. If you do have one at home, moist, warm heat, and if you can see a shell, rubbing a bit of sort of medical type lubrication like Vaseline or, you know, KY jelly or something like that on the shell with your finger to try and help it out can help. Try not to smash it. That's a horrible thing to have inside you, as a smashed egg. But yeah, moist heat, like you would use to steam your head for a cold, not hot. And you can sometimes put them in a carrier with a towel over the bowl. Just make sure you're not getting them too hot. If you can't get it out for a whole day and it's definitely stuck there, that is a bit of an emergency. You don't want to leave that for a weekend, because you've just blocked all of the exits for that chicken. The sort of pee part coming from the kidneys and the poo part obviously coming from the intestines, as well as the egg part, all just go out through the same hole. Bumblefoot I get asked about. It is an infection on the bottom of the feet. If you've got leaky drinkers or poor ventilation, or there's dirty areas, or you've got really fat pet birds or just gigantic chickens, some of the really huge breeds like Brahmas and things can get bumblefoot more. Or if you've got rough perches or perches that are too thin, or if your ground surface is a bit too abrasive, if they're out there scratching about on a really sharp gravel or something, those are all reasons that you could end up with bumblefoot. But if you see that wound on the foot, it is probably going to need some proper treatment. If you just see very, very early on where there's a bit of, you know, it's just starting to get a wee bit eroded and it's not looking as bad as all that is in the picture, you can sometimes get away with keeping it clean and keeping them on a smoother surface and making sure that they're not on thin perches. But by the time it's gotten all swollen and horrible like that, they do usually need proper treatment. The crop we talked about, if that is enlarged or doughy or squishy, it could be that the crop is blocked, so you can kind of just about see that big lump in the front of the chicken there. If it's firm, it could be blocked. It could have ate string. It could be really long grass clippings are not good for your chickens. They just ball up and they get stuck. Sometimes they get a yeast infection, which is basically thrush in the crop. That would be more a squishy, fluidy crop with really, really bad breath, especially if you've just rubbed the crop. Then the chicken sometimes has vomity bad breath. It can be caused by sudden dietary changes, like for instance, if you've had ex-commercial rescue hens, if their digestion isn't geared for the fibrous material that they've just found in your garden, or maybe you don't have enough water or grit out for them, they just haven't got used to the new environment just yet. If it's just impacted food, like too dry food, making sure that they get plenty of water and maybe a little bit of olive oil or something, and a little bit of massaging the crop with really great care, it can sometimes help just shift that. If it's long string or incredibly long grass clippings or something, your vet is probably going to have to be involved in that. If it is the squishy, sort of pendulous way, the elastic tissues of the crop might have been damaged, or maybe you've got that thrush infection. These can be treated, but the prognosis isn't quite as good. Because you've got your thrush infection, that's going to need treatment, probably from the vet. It's going to need the horrible bitter stuff taken out of the crop, and sometimes you need an antifungal treatment put into the crop. If it's really early on and it's just been spotted, you can sometimes try and get on top of it with some probiotics that will try and bring the environment of the crop back to normal. You'll find them on like the chickenvet.co.uk shop or other shops, probiotics specifically for chickens. For a preventative, the VicVet website does recommend apple cider vinegar. It is diluted in that dilution, 10 ml for every 500 mils, for around about 1 week out of every month as a prevention, because if you keep the crop quite acidic, then the thrush infection is less likely to happen. However, from a treatment point of view, when you've got all that sour, horrible fluid squishing about in the crop, apple cider vinegar probably isn't going to cut it for treatment. Or probably really early on, you might get away with the probiotics. If it's quite advanced, you're probably looking at potential veterinary treatment, especially if you've got a pet. If you do get sour crop, it can sometimes be secondary to something else as well. If you end up with that massive baggy crop like that, there's something else perhaps just going on with that chicken. For instance, one of the ones that I had with Marek's disease kept getting sour crop. We would actually get rid of it and it would go back to normal, and then it would just get sour crop again. And I think the innervation to the crop was preventing it. The damage to the nerves in the crop was preventing it from emptying properly, and then everything was just going all sour. So yeah, it can be a sign of something else. And the last thing to say is mention coccidiosis very briefly. The reason I'm mentioning it to you is it will need a treatment, even if you have in your young birds the special feed that has the anticoccidial in it. Sometimes if you have too many coccidia in your environment, that will overcome the medicated feed, and you will see signs of the diarrhea, sometimes bloody, at around about that 3 to 6 week mark. If you see that, act really quickly. Coccidiosis tends to go through them very quickly. It'll damage their guts. You'll never quite get as well-grown chickens and as resilient chickens as you wanted. It can sometimes kill them really quickly. Prevention for coccidiosis is always better than cure. So if you do have a coccidiosis problem, make sure your hygiene's pretty much on point. Make sure that there's not a damp environment, you've got plenty of ventilation, and that you use a good disinfectant that is effective against coccidial oocysts, which is what we call the eggs of the coccidia, if you like, the sort of egg equivalent of coccidia. They do need a wee low-level exposure to coccidia when they're young to develop immunity, but sometimes if there's too many of them in a dirty environment or a wet environment, or one of them's gotten ill with it and is pooping coccidia everywhere, then that will overcome either the medicated feed or their own natural resistance, depending on what you use. Not everybody uses the medicated feed. Not everybody needs it. So yeah, it's something to watch out for. There are a few other problems that you do see in young birds as well. You can get bacterial infections and viruses and so on, but always remember that if you are looking at a group problem, stress predisposes any age of chicken to getting ill. If you do have very young birds that are getting ill, don't just jump to the conclusion that it's coccidiosis. Young birds are going to be incredibly predisposed to getting really ill really fast. So with those ones, I wouldn't really be using a wait and see approach to anything. I would be going, oh, there's something wrong with the young chickens. The group seems to be unwell. I probably want to try and get that diagnosed as fast as possible. And it can sometimes be as simple as they've had a fairly poor start in life, and there's plenty of nutritional and management stuff to look at. And that also pertains to if you've bought some in at a slightly older age. The nutrition and the management of where they've come from is also sometimes as important as what they've come to on your premises.